So yeah, I'm really happy to see you today, and I hope for the meaningful and interesting conversation with you today about your work, about your also how you are working right now on the Indo-Japan relations, because for me it's also interesting as I am also researching about that. So today we will come to some scheduling as well. So the everything will be under 60 minutes or maybe less if it is will be better, because I know there's this evening in Japan. So and also it's Saturday, so I'm really grateful for your time today. So today I want to show you what we're gonna do. I will share
Mm-hmm.
course. Okay. Do you see it?
It still says okay, yes, I see it now.
Oh,
Thank you.
nice,
Yes.
nice. Thank you so much. So today our scheduling is like that. So for now, I will also do the opening remarks, self-introduction. After that, we will have keynote lecture, a focus topic on Japan, and mostly it will be about forthcoming LDP leadership elections, which we are currently interested in right now, what is happening with the internal Japanese politics. And for Q&A, I had some questions, so I really hoping to actually inter like inter understand and speak with you about that. So I hope it will be really interesting. And for the closing remarks, I also will have like some a summary and next steps, maybe also to talk about what you want to do next in your career and something like that. So I'm really happy to start it. So let's start.
Absolutely. Let's get started. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much. So, good evening, everyone. I'm Maria, and I'm head of grants of ADASTRA. This is big think tank in Ukraine. And right now, I'm also residing in Japan. I'm second year master student in international relations, political science. My research focuses on Southeast Asia and Japan role in regional dynamics, which is security, trade, climate, and soft power. And it's my pleasure to moderate tonight's conversation with you. Uh, Astha Chadha. I hope I will pronounce it better, maybe, but I hope it is fine. The pronunciation is
Perfectly
fine.
fine.
Astha Chadha. Yes, thank you. Associate Professor of Ritsumeikan University, who has made significant contributions in understanding India-Japan relations and moral and general dimensions of diplomacy and also historical memory in foreign policy. So I was also want you to maybe to hear from you about you, how you arrived from and studying India-Japan ties, what keeps this passion alive, and how you are linking everything, identity, security, normativity in your work, what you're currently doing.
Okay, thank you, Maria, for organizing this talk today. And I am very grateful that we could find a mutual time where we
Yes,
could really discuss this topic, which I think is of a lot of interest, specifically regarding what is the Japanese role in the world, whether it's in peace building or it's in cooperation or it's in development or supporting economic security, right? Not just in its immediate neighborhood, but also in the wider Indo-Pacific and maybe
yes,
even beyond, right? And
yes,
Japan does that in several ways. So I got interested, to answer your question, I got interested in India-Japan relations while I was working in the banking sector, and I was working for a Japanese investment bank a few years ago. And I used to notice that business in itself, because that time I was looking at the business side of things and the finance side of things, and I could see that a lot of geopolitical movements were directly impacting the
mm,
business, right?
yes, yes,
And one example of that was, for instance, Japan had already launched or talked about funding the Shinkansen project in India.
mm-hmm.
And for the longest time, we've been waiting for it, and it's moving, but very, very slow, right? So one is
Mm-hmm.
left to wonder that the money has come in, and diplomatically, the countries are doing well. So what is keeping this movement what is kind of slowing down that momentum, right? And so
Mm-hmm.
I decided, because I was essentially a graduate in economics, and so my idea of looking at that was through a very economic lens, theoretical,
Mm-hmm.
both theoretical and practical. But then I decided, to complete or to get a better view of what's happening, I needed to study international relations. And so, in order to do that, to do my second master's, I decided to pursue the topic of India-Japan relations in the Indian Ocean, and
Mm-hmm.
how Japan and India are together promoting or seeking security in India's immediate neighborhood and the wider Indo-Pacific. And so I explored things like Quad, which is a mini-lateral framework, and the wider Indo-Pacific security architecture, and what is the position of India and Japan in it. So that's how I got interested in it. Why I think it's important? Because I think Japan is one of the very, I would say, key players when it comes to the Pacific. So
Mm-hmm.
United States has remained and probably will continue to remain one of those major powers that large chunk of the world looks up to in terms of keeping the status quo, or in some measure maintaining certain security, or what we understand today as the free, open, inclusive, and rule-based Indo-Pacific, right? So these
Yes,
terms have
yes.
a lot of importance. And so a lot of countries look up to the US and its security architecture, or its framework, its ally network, to make sure
Mm-hmm.
that that is maintained, right? There is no one power that dominates anything. And in order to do that, United States also needs partners in the Indo-Pacific. It cannot really promote that security alone. And so India is one of those emerging global powers, not just a
Mm-hmm.
regional power. And Japan has been a traditional ally, we would say, at least since post-World War II. So Japan emerging as that fulcrum of US security seeking in the wider Indo-Pacific, and India, on the other hand, in the Indian Ocean, and projecting power,
Mm-hmm.
and sort of a cooperation. So I think those two, they are in some ways post-pandemic. I think that partnership is just getting started. And 2025 has been very significant in that development. So, as we get a little bit into the lecture, I'll try and highlight why this partnership is so important,
Mm-hmm.
specifically now that we are looking at it in 2025.
Thank you so much. And also, I as understand you are also seeking the understanding of the infrastructure and the architecture of the foreign relation with Japan and India and US, right? That's right.
Yeah. Yes.
Um, And for me, I also was researching about your work, and especially about like the recent was about the Gandhi, Ghost of Gandhi essay, which was really interesting for me. So I was wanting to actually want you to say about how do you balance the structural analysis, like economy, power, with this normative symbolic dimensions, which includes like memory, includes also religion aspect of that. I'm really interested in that as well.
Okay, that's a very wonderful question. So, see, when I studied IR, when I look at IR from one dimension,
Mm-hmm.
uh, the most important, or let's say the key debates tend to be centered around economics or military buildup, or
Mm-hmm.
some such form of a combination of a power projection which allows a power to remain a power in a region.
Mm-hmm.
But if you try and look at the multidimensional aspect of security, everything and anything that you mentioned is part of it. Everything has a contribution. So one cannot just talk about the role of United States in the Indo-Pacific by overlooking the other softer aspects that has been known for, right? How do people, so for instance, how do people outside of the American sphere of influence, how do people connect with the United States as a cultural power? And US does have a lot of soft power that ways, right? So
Okay.
similarly, when I look at, even in that essay, when I was looking at Gandhi, I mean, Gandhi was basically one symbol of an idea of how international relations could maybe looked at in a, I would say, through a different lens. So instead of making security seeking the ultimate end, and then using things like introspection as tools to achieve that, maybe introspection should be the end. That should be the objective. Making, taking away all of this, I mean, look at IR theory. It's very centered around the fact that there's anarchy, and all states are seeking maximization of their national interest. So what that reduces our understanding, like basic understanding, is to a zero-sum game. One state gains, another state loses. There is no such theoretical idea which allows for a collective development. There is a collective security community or a collective security seeking for sure. But again, that creates a club of nations that do it. And then there are always those that are left out. That essay tried to, in a way, challenge it maybe in a little way, or question that assumption, and see maybe we have been understanding, or maybe we have been doing international relations in the practical arena in a very
Yes,
self-centered way, right? So
yes.
that essay looked into it. As for how religion and culture impact IR, I mean, the most commonly understood way is through soft power. That is
Mm,
how it has been generally theorized, right?
yes.
But when I wrote my dissertation, which was turned into a book, when I wrote that, which is called Faith and Politics in South Asia, I basically, once again, I tried to argue that maybe there are states and state actors that are looking at history through a religious lens. So their understanding of history is not as practical or as secular as the international relations discipline claims to be. So maybe
Mhm.
IR and secularism are not the same thing. We need to
Yes.
challenge those basic assumptions.
Yes, thank you so much for this point, because for me as well, I think realistic aspects of the politics is more on the surface, and it was always more discussed than actually some soft power or memory politics or ontological security, which is also, in my opinion, really important. And I would like to ask you about how do you see this aspect of the soft power of this ontological security in the Japan and India relations? How this ghost of Gandhi can also play the role of securing the relation with Japan, of like India and Japan or other countries?
Okay. I mean, India and Japan, if you look at purely cultural ties, they have dated back, and I mean, no matter what book or what journal article, what reading you do on India and Japan, it always refers back to this fact that Buddhism came from India via China into Japan around 6th century AD, and how it created sort of a cultural exchange in that era.
Mm,
But if you look at it today, Buddhism cannot it is an important factor, but it cannot be the only factor of cultural exchange. I mean, the states have evolved, their identities have evolved over time. That India of the ancient India, or that ancient Japan, is no more the same, right? So
mm,
if we have to understand how maybe culture, religion, or let's say the idea of non-violence, for instance, how could they play a role? We need to first look at what are they seeking in terms of collaboration. So in that essay that you mentioning that I wrote, it was basically focusing on conflicts,
mm,
domestic conflicts in India and international conflicts. So similarly, India and Japan don't really have any conflicts amongst them. So that is one less of a problem. But what they do have is too many promising areas of cooperation which have not been realized to the full potential. And with that, I want to come to what happened in 2025 that is very important, both in terms of hard power or hard security seeking and soft power in
mm,
India-Japan relations. I'll try and summarize it for you in very like easy terms so that anyone who's interested can maybe look it up if that interests them. So, one thing that India and Japan have been stressing for the longest time and have not been able to achieve is economic security and trade. So their trade is stable, but it hasn't grown
mhm,
beyond a certain point. So in 2025, they basically what they did is they, in a way, you could say they in a way elevated that partnership after 10 years of the previous elevation. And what they said is we're going to expand and widen the scope of this partnership. So it's no longer going to be an economics, trade, or military, whatever, they signed an AXA agreement, which means they can use each other's bases. So not those basics. We need to go beyond it, right? And so they included a lot of non-traditional security arenas, which is outer space security, right?
mm,
Which
yes,
is going maybe also into defense security, but let's say maritime security initiatives, or making sure that they keep the continuation of health security as one of those potential areas of cooperation. They started a digital partnership for cybersecurity. And it is important, why I'm highlighting this, it's important to understand that maybe normatively, India and Japan don't have to think alike. They just have to find common points of common intersections where there might be an overlap in their objectives. And that is the kind of idea that we are looking at, whether it's through soft power or it's through hard power, is to find more and more avenues for cooperation. Because the newer or the more recent debates around, I just today I flew in from Taiwan, and the discussion we had there was, what is this new global world order going to look like? So there's already a discussion as to maybe this is not going to be the same world order. The world is changing. So if it's changing, what is it going to transform into? And so India and Japan need to find a space for themselves there, because Japan is a traditional US ally. India does not do alliances. India only has partners. So, with that kind of a very clear difference in foreign policy doing as a practice, even theory or even ideology, how do two nations, any two nations, find an overlap? And that is, I think, a common challenge across the globe between any country, any two countries, or a group of nations, but specifically India and Japan because they are very committed to this partnership. And
Mhm.
so I think widening the scope of that relationship in 2025 was one step closer towards achieving that goal.
Thank you so much for this also insights. For me, this overlap also, I want to get the audience to understanding what we are talking about. In August 2025, as I think Professor is referring to, about the India-Japan joint vision for the next decade, right?
Yes.
Yes, so it was like about committing double private Japanese investment in India. And this is also furthering deepen trade, supply chain resilience. And right now, they also renewed their joint declaration on security cooperation. And for me, I see this as big ambition, big framework of ambition. And I want to ask you, given these bold targets of the vision statement, what do you see right now as the core pillars, which is economic, technological, or strategic, that maybe will sustain India-Japan ties? On what core pillars will it mostly will sustain India-Japan ties from now on?
Sure. So I can give you five such pillars. Of course, we could break it down and create more mini pillars out of it, but there are five main arenas, I would say, of that partnership. So one is obviously the economic security and trade, which will continue to maintain a very high potential until it's realized, right? And
Mhm.
within that, I would club pretty much the idea of investment, which is Japanese investment into India, whether it's in the Northeast, whether it's in the India's, Himalayan region, mountainous regions, or whether it is in India's small islands, which are located in the Indian Ocean in very strategically important zones, right? So, right from when you go out of the Malacca Strait, you land straight into one of those Indian islands, which is Andaman and Nicobar. And there hasn't been a lot of development, and Indian government has traditionally tried to keep international partners away from it. It's a protected piece of land and also strategically important. But
Mhm.
Japan has now become a partner in it, right? So
Yes.
things like massive infrastructure, things like focusing on critical supply chains, making sure that there is huge investment in, let's say, or partnership of some sort in India's nascent, still developing semiconductor sector, which is not big at all, but it is growing up to be, or the fact that they want to collaborate on critical minerals, pharmaceuticals, for health security, as we earlier talked about, right?
Yes.
Clean energy, digital partnership, digital connectivity, artificial intelligence, cybersecurity. So, all of this makes into the pillar of economic security. The second one
Mhm.
would be the emerging newer space of defense and security, which is hardcore defense, right? Which in a way reflects in the way they elevated their strategic partnership, the strategic alignment, right? And so they announced a joint declaration on security cooperation, as you mentioned, in August 2025, and this
Yes.
was to make sure that there is more interoperability, irrespective of the kind of weapons or the kind of defense infrastructure these two countries have, which is different, right? India is still developing its defense industry and it's becoming one of those giants. And Japan has not traditionally had a very strong defense because it is part of that US Japan security partnership, right? But now Japan is also, in a way, I would argue, evolving into it. The fact that they have signed an AXA, which is an acquisition and cross servicing agreement. For people who don't know, it's about providing logistical support to each other's militaries in some way, right? For like repairs, maintenance of defense equipment, so on and so forth, or things like counterterrorism. cybersecurity, things on which India, Japan have maybe talked about, but they haven't had a lot of cooperation about, right?
Mhm.
So, and of course, let's not forget maritime security, which is very important. Uh, Under it also, I would kind of, or we could put a separate pillar, which is again a growing pillar. That would be pillar number three, which is outer space. Those are the areas which are considered as mainly nobody controls it. That's the true definition in a way of anarchy, because there's no one body, international body, that controls the outer space. Who really can claim it? Who can make sure that, they have a lot of hegemony over it? So that needs a lot of collaboration. And so there are maybe two main examples of that collaboration that has emerged pretty much in the last decade. One is the Lunar Polar Exploration Project between India's Space Research Organization and the JAXA, which is the Japanese space organization. And this is going to be the Chandrayaan 5. So India's already had four iterations, and this would be the number five lunar mission for India, but the first for Japan India collaboration at that scale, right? And their
Mhm.
idea is to explore the lunar South Pole. So they're going into the areas which are less, in a way, explored. Similarly, the newer space that they have created for themselves in outer space arrangement is the Space Situational Awareness Cooperation, which is in a way allowing them to track and monitor the space debris. There are a lot of satellites and things that are just floating in outer space, and in a way creates space pollution. So they're trying to make sure that they can navigate those. There are no accidents per se, but also they need to keep themselves and globally. They're trying to promote that awareness around the space debris.
Mhm.
Also, in a way, making sure that there is less militarization in the space, because that is what's kind of getting fostered in some way, right? So that
Yeah.
space collaboration would be another one. Again, you could add to it the ideas that some private companies in Japan, since India opened up its space sector to privatization, a lot of Japanese companies now have the potential to enter the Indian space market, which is huge. Make investments, fund newer projects, fund the nascent ventures. Number four would be climate and disaster resilience. So India has been a very disaster-prone nation. We do have a lot of landslides. I mean, if you look up the news just in the past 1 month, floods, landslides, cyclones, and too many people dying as a result of it. Japan, too, is a very disaster prone region. We've heard of the tsunamis, we've heard of the frequent earthquakes. But Japan, what has Japan achieved way better than India is how to combat that, how to build that resilience to climate change and disaster, right? And so, India and Japan collaborating on that essentially means that India is going to gain a lot of insights from the Japanese advancement in that region. So they are now working on a coalition for disaster resilient infrastructure. And India is also leading an initiative which is supported by Japan, which is on Asian disaster reduction. Similarly, in terms of climate change, India is also part of and the leader in a way in promoting it together with France of the International Solar Alliance. And Japan is a member of it. So see, they already have kind of those mechanisms on which they can cooperate. They just need to boost it,
Mhm.
right? To make sure that they are going to clean energy. And lastly, the fifth, I think the pillar which is going to again be very important is strategic connectivity. This is not just about India and India's Shinkansen project. This is about making sure that other countries, wherever they are in the global south, whether that's Southeast Asia, South Asia, Pacific Islands, smaller islands in the African coast, that is towards the Arabian Sea, all of those have the opportunities towards connectivity to the larger Indo-Pacific. Otherwise, they will end up being very secluded from this idea of free, open, and inclusive Indo-Pacific. So they have, for instance, Japan and India already have an Act East initiative, which is in a way you could argue it is concentrated in India's northeast, but that is very secluded. So to connect it in some way to the Bay of Bengal, or the Partnership for Quality Infrastructure, which Japan promotes. For the wider Indo-Pacific. So, for instance, Japan and India are together working on some port-related projects in Sri Lanka, or Japan is now developing some ports in Bangladesh. So they are making sure that they are able to collaborate with maybe India's diplomatic power and Japanese financial power, or Japanese diplomatic power and India stepping in as kind of an ODA provider, no longer an ODA recipient only. provider
Mhm.
in the region, because India looks at itself as a net security provider in the Indian Ocean. So I would say, I would argue these are the main five pillars. They were in some form already there in the previous agreement, but I think they've widened the scope now. So what that allows India and Japan to do is make sure that there is now very directed private sector investment in those arenas.
Mhm. Thank you. Thank you so much for this also insights how the Japan and how India they can actually mutually exchange their views and also the resources they have, which is also for me particularly interesting because they now India doesn't want to be just a recipe, right? So they want to organize their relation in that way that there will be equal, totally equal. And I want to also know about the reasoning of that, how and why, what is the reasoning behind this stabilization and this mutual benefit relations?
Okay, so you're essentially asking me about why India and Japan are willing to collaborate in this equal partnership,
Yes,
right?
yes, yes.
Okay. So see, if you look at Japanese foreign policy back before 1990s, when India was styled in a very socialist economy, very Soviet styled economy before India liberalized in 1991, back then South Asia was not of a lot of focus in Japanese foreign policy. So the Japanese looked at South Asia as Southwest Asia, comparing it to Southeast Asia, right? And so ASEAN was the rising, a lot of Asian
Mm,
tigers, and ASEAN was the rising, economically rising arena there. And South Asian nations were just newly independent and maybe not doing too much. So what essentially happened is that changed once India liberalized, globalized, and privatized its sector. So the model of economics changed, and Japan, way back in 2007, Prime Minister Abe made a speech in the Indian Parliament wherein it was called Confluence of the Two Seas, which is, by the way, seen as by a lot of scholars as the emerging point of a very formalized idea of Indo-Pacific as we see today, because it is pretty much the confluence of two oceans, the Pacific Ocean and the Indian Ocean. So people trace it back to what Prime Minister Abe did back then. So we see a lot of policies started changing then. Japan wanted to really enter into the Indian Ocean for several reasons. South Asia represents a huge market. A large chunk of the world population is concentrated. India alone accounts for maybe 1/7 or something like that of the total global population. So imagine the amount of youths, imagine the amount of human capital India has. And Japan is, as you know, a very aging economy. So one is human capital. One is the skilled labor that Japan could get. Second, it is India being an emerging economy also was a site of, or a wonderful destination for investment. And so a lot of Japanese India projects started happening within the Indian territory. But what has changed since the emergence of Indo-Pacific as a concept or as a geographical term or as a strategic arena is that both of them have found a space wherein India's potential is harnessed uh, to realize what is India's strategic goal, which is India no longer wants to see Indian Ocean as a contest zone between US and China or any other few powers. It wants to look at it as a secure zone wherein at least South Asia or the wider, what you would say, the family, Southeast Asia, South Asia, and Africa, they stay connected and they're in a way self dependent. They're self-reliant in their trade, right? And for that, they need reliable partners who are willing to invest without very obvious agendas, be it political or geopolitical agendas, right? No interference in
Yeah.
domestic politics. And Japan has been consistently one of those nations that has uh, allowed that kind of a culture to foster it through its foreign aid. And JICA was the funding agency that, holding a lot of doing a lot of projects right from Central Asia,
Yes,
Africa,
yes.
India, and Southeast Asia and South Asia.
All
So
countries.
given that, yes, so they've tried to promote it at that level. That why don't two countries, one emerging power, earlier regional power and now emerging global power, and one which is Japan, which is already considered as one of the normative powers, maybe not militarily, but at least economically, it's still a very, very important country, right? So why
Mm,
don't they both combine whatever synergies they have and then look at true realization of a free, open, and inclusive Indo-Pacific?
mhm. Thank you. Thank you so much for this. And we want to move out for the next block, if it is okay with you.
Yes, perfect.
Yeah, thank you. So we want to talk about also the soft power as we talked about before. And I want to ask you the general question. Have you seen in Japan-India diplomacy any explicit references to invoke this soft power, this um, the special explicit reference to the memory or ethics, the India-Japan memory, which is invokes this kind of soft power influence on those relations and strengthening them.
Yes, absolutely. Actually, it is one of the topics I would say which is less talked about. So, if you
Mhm.
look at the policy documents that come out of India and Japan with regard to each other or their bilateral partnership, there is always, like I mentioned earlier, a reference to India as the land of Buddha, or India as that cultural power in a way, right? That
Yes.
cultural, religious, civilizational power. And once you evoke that idea of Buddhism, Japan cannot be left out. Actually, pretty much a large chunk of the world gets included in it because if you look towards the south, specifically towards the Indian
Mhm.
Ocean and going into ASEAN nations, or you go through the land route, which is India through China, Korea, and Japan, they're pretty much connected with that ideology, with that civilizational history in
Yeah.
some way. So that keeps getting evoked. Now, examples of those is that India, for example, has created this new policy, which is not in 2025. It goes back at least close to a decade. But India started promoting a Buddhist circuit. And what that means is making sure that there is funding available for reviving, reconstruction, or maintenance of ancient Buddhist spots, which is not only for tourism purposes but also for cultural, religious, or just traditional heritage purposes
Mhm.
across the global south.
Yes.
So India is funding that, and Japan is pretty much part of that initiative. Also, they launched, for example, India-Japan Tourism Exchange Year, and the idea was to bring more Japanese into India and likewise Indians to Japan, and make sure that they understand there's a cross-cultural understanding and people-to-people connection. And then, very recently, in the past 2 years, there has been a new policy, and they named it very, very, very beautifully, and they said connecting Himalayas and Mount Fuji. And what that means is they're going one step further because now they want to include culture, civilization together with strategic objectives. So
Mhm.
connecting Himalayas with Mount Fuji is not just about India and Japan working towards, their mountain cultures or making sure that they are civilizational powers. They want to take it a step beyond and say, hey, we need to connect the Himalayas and Himalayan security to the Indo-Pacific. So those would be my readings of how India and Japan are trying to use this cultural diplomacy in a way and use it towards greater security objectives or greater people-to-people understanding. Individually, also, they have pretty much tried to promote it. So, for instance, Japan provides technical and educational cooperation with through its JDS or JICA scholarships. Similarly, India promotes an Indian technical and economic cooperation, which is bringing people from large number of countries in the global south, including from Latin America. So it's a wider, way wider scope, and making sure that there is training and scholarships available to people not just from South Asia but also beyond. And lastly, what I have seen very successfully happen in Japan is India promoting the International Yoga Day. So
Mhm.
yoga is one of those civilizational, spiritual, and cultural exports from India to the entire world. And Japan has really embraced it with a lot of love. So 2025, when this meeting happened between Minister Ishiba, the earlier Prime Minister
Yeah.
Ishiba,
Okay. Yes.
India's current Prime Minister Modi, they said that they're going to bring in close to 500,000 Indians into Japan to help with their workforce, skilled labor. But how do you make sure that these people are able to stay there, understand each other's cultures, which is through promoting this kind of cultural understanding, right? Similarly, there is an emerging collaboration in filmmaking, media sector, which you can see, a lot of Indian filmmakers are now interested in Japan. And I think recently a very famous Japanese actor has collaborated with one of the films to be made in India. So again, this is a promotion. This is opening up for wider cultural cooperation, making sure. I mean, some Indian films are actually pretty famous in Japan already. They did good business, but not to the extent that one would imagine, right? So they're trying to promote those. So I think those are a lot of good cultural exports from both countries into each other's nations to promote that people to people connection.
Mhm. Thank you. And maybe there's also one of the some hurdles, some aspect that actually makes Japan and India relation, and maybe before because it just started right now, that makes it hard. It was hard to make those relations. What was that, in your opinion?
Yeah, I mean, one was for the longest time, like I said earlier, before 1991. I mean, if you look at the Cold War era, the earlier challenges, which are no longer challenges, but earlier challenges, but very resilient and persistent challenges, were Japan trying to overcome the inertia of accepting India as a nuclear power. That was very
Mhm.
critical to those debates, right? India was developing its nuclear energy, and similarly, South Asia now has three nuclear powers. It's China, India, and Pakistan. So the development and that sort of a nuclear triangle that was forming there, and Japan is very sensitive to this debate around nuclear power, and especially nuclear weapons. So it took them time, but once the ice melted, once they tried to promote better relations, I think Japan overcame it, and now they are in a better space to kind of collaborate on so many other measures. I think still some challenges remain, one of which would be overcoming bureaucratic hurdles. So one example I'll give you is of the Asia-Africa Growth Corridor. Sure, I'll summarize it for you. So basically, it was an initiative launched and I mean formally launched in 2017, and the
Mhm.
idea was that there have been a lot of see initially historically there has been a lot of presence of European nations, Western European nations, who were the erstwhile colonizers in Africa, and even today people argue it's kind of a form of a neo-colonization that has existed in some forms in Africa over its natural resources, which they call the resource curse. So what happened then is that China came up with investments for development, things like developing railways or constructing school buildings, things
Yes.
on infrastructure that was required or very much needed by the people in several African nations. And that was part of the Belt and Road Initiative of China.
Mhm.
However, some countries started showing a lot of concerns. I guess, or probably some of our listeners might have heard of it. What happened in Sri Lanka, right? And so the idea was that if Chinese investment does come with terms and conditions, can it be possible to promote a form of development that carries no financial burden and no implications for leasing for 99 years any port or any such strategic asset in a particular country, that doesn't put it in financial trouble or doesn't push it towards bankruptcy, because a lot of these nations are underdeveloped. They are still developing and they still need the infrastructure. They need the loans, but they probably cannot pay them off in a short
Mhm.
amount of time.
Mhm.
And so Japan came out with its equal, this superior, this quality infrastructure idea together with India. And the idea was that India would use its diplomatic capital, Japan would use its investment, they would co-invest through public-private partnership of some sorts into different African nations and promote small development projects which would address specific needs of specific African countries. Not two nations might need the same thing, right? Some of them might need more health security, some others might need more railways, some others might need some other kind of infrastructure. So the idea was to make it a very need based partnership. But
Mhm.
what happened is it was launched, it was very welcome. At least it was seen like a positive, maybe not an alternative or a threat in any way to the European or Chinese investments, but maybe yet another option in the basket for African countries to choose from. It was a different model of development. But nothing really progressed too much on it.
Mhm.
And so it could be, I mean, there have been variety of reasons. One was that there was again this bureaucratic delay. There were also not a lot of agreements as to how, what amount of funding would come from where. There was also a lot of, let's say, not resistance per se, but a lot of question marks, or a lot of skepticism in the business community as to what would happen to those investments, because if private sector wants to come and it wants to see some returns of the sorts, right? So
Yes.
again, on the whole, I think it was wonderfully crafted policy, at least in its very nascent form, but nothing really developed. So you were asking me, are there problems in the India-Japan collaboration? I would say that is one problem in the
Mhm.
India-Japan collaboration, that even though they have brilliant ideas, they can really elevate not just their mutual partnership, but also probably in a triangular relationship or in a quadrilateral relationship, they can really elevate different dimensions of security in the region that really needs it, but it takes too much time. So
Yeah.
it
Too
sounds
much
like a
time.
missed opportunity.
Mhm.
Yes.
Yes, so there's also some bureaucracy moments as well of this partnerships that it was also kind of delaying their time to create the relationship. Thank you so much for this insightful also talking about the India-Japan relation. And now we're moving on to the block three, which is about Japan's October 4 elections, which will be soon happening just in 1 week. And there was also, I want to just mini frame to our also listeners that right now we are having with five people, or which is Sasae Takaichi, Shinjiro Koizumi, and other also Hayashi and Koizumi, Motegi, Kobayashi, um, people who are right now launching their leadership race. And in July 2025, LDP and Komeito lost their majority in both chambers. And also before that, Prime Minister Ishiba announced his resignation in light of the electoral defeats. And right now we see that there's also Takaichi that have been talking about the fiscading measures, including bond issuance to support social policy, while Koizumi also emphasized structural reforms. And I want with Professor to examine how this context might influence Japan foreign policy trajectory. As I know you also talking and you were also writing some news about this happening about the foreign policy and also internal policy of Japan, as I may know. Can you talk about this more, elaborate more about that?
Okay, sure. So I'll try and address this question basically in two parts, right? So one,
Yes.
I'll try and discuss what are the main challenges for
Mhm.
Japan now that it is standing again at the edge of yet
Mhm.
another election in a very short time.
Yes.
So and then I'll try and address maybe what are the implications of any potential leadership towards Japanese foreign policy. So
Mhm.
first, let's look at the domestic politics. So any new leader, we can look at the conditions under which Prime Minister Ishiba had to resign, and you can see a pattern emerging. So he had to resign uh, amongst several challenges, right? Them losing an absolute majority in both the houses, that was one. So there's a severe electoral defeat, which is not just for the LDP, it is the coalition that together lost, which is even worse, right? Then
Yes.
there is the issue of beyond the electoral defeat, there is the issue of financial scandals, right? Slush funds controversy that a lot of LDP leadership has been accused of. And then there is the public discontent because Japan is experiencing inflation. Salaries are not moving together with the inflation. And so people are not very happy about this. This is leading to some sort of an economic insecurity at a household level. So any new person who comes in to fill in the shoes of Prime Minister Ishiba will have to deal not just with political instability, which his predecessors have created, but also economic discontent, disappointment of the voters of LDP, and internal party divisions. Because let's not forget that LDP is also internally very faction based. It's very fractured in that sense. So there are small little groups, different factions who might want to pitch their own candidate this time. And then, last but not the least, anybody who emerges as the LDP leader might not need not even be the prime minister. So they are dealing with several issues at the same time. So they have to, whoever comes into power will need to make sure that there is no legislative paralysis as a result of the minority government, right? Whatever budget they release for 2026 will have to look at tax reform, supplementary budgets, making sure that they are not diluting any of these important Japanese foreign policies in any way. That person will have to rebuild public trust as a result of previous scandals, as a result of inflation, stagnant wages which are not moving together with inflation, right? Because you remember during COVID, And even after that, Japanese government had started providing cash handouts. They were sending money, and the
Mhm.
public was not happy about that policy. They
Mhm.
didn't think Samman or Juman would alleviate their poverty or alleviate their concerns about economy in general, right? So that was not seen as a very positive policy. So whoever comes will have to get creative to regain trust of the public. And lastly, whoever comes in will also have to make sure that there is party unity. If LDP continues to remain fractured, it will impact any consensus building even within the party. And if that person ends up becoming the face of Japan as the prime minister, is going to face even more opposition from the from the opposition in the public, from opposition in the parliament, and from internal opposition as well. So they need to restore everything at the same time. Public trust, party unity, making sure that their policies are not flawed this time. And last but not the least, economic insecurity, which is looming large in Japan. So now you pointed out that there are some candidates, right? How could that impact Japanese foreign policy towards the region, or maybe how could that impact India-Japan relations? So as of September 2025, I mean, I can broadly talk about three very clearly potential leaders. I cannot say if they're going to really win the elections, but they have pitched themselves as potential leaders. And one of them is Sanai Takaichi. She's seen as a nationalist. She's seen as staunch supporter of Prime Minister Shinzo Abe and his idea, whether it was Abenomics or whether it was Shinzo Abe's ideas of the free and open Indo-Pacific. So any normative or ideological base that Shinzo Abe built, Sanai Takaichi supports that. So she happens to be a conservative and a nationalist. Now, given that she has previously had experience as the Minister of Economic Security, and hence her ideas of dealing with Japan in the Indo-Pacific, or partners like US and India are going to
Mhm.
probably look more towards prioritizing defense cooperation.
Yes.
That was pretty much on the agenda of Prime Minister Shinzo Abe. It is going to probably be on her agenda as well. So you could see a boost in Quad joint exercises, joint economic security measures, resilient supply chains, critical technology, so on and so forth that we were earlier discussing. So all of these are going to continue to be very important aspects or points in Japanese foreign policy. Similarly, she's had a very firm stance on China and China's impact on regional security in South China Sea or East China Sea. So that could probably lead to being the basis of continuing greater relations with India, because Japan does understand that India also has concerns regarding relations with China, right? And they've recently had a series of border standoffs. So that leads to more insecurity in the region. Shinjiro Koizumi, on the other hand, is seen as a very young face in Japanese politics, right? He's seen as a reformist. He has been the former Minister of Environment. So you could probably see that him being young and him being somebody who talks about environment, clean energy, is probably could lead to Japan in a way reforming its soft power in some way, or reiterating it in some power, in some measure. So he could promote things mainly focusing rather than defense and Japanese security posturing. He's more likely probably to talk about things like green diplomacy focus, economic security, for instance. Japan trying to build up its EV, electronic vehicle infrastructure, reducing in some way, creating Japanese resilience economically and reducing dependence on China or pure traditional partners, right? So with regard to India, he's also, I mean, more or less, because Japan has traditionally, no matter the political changes domestically, they've maintained stable relations. So no matter who comes to power, relations with India would likely remain same or similar, but maybe the emphasis might change. The third person you mentioned was Toshimitsu Motegi, right?
Yes,
He
yes,
was the
Motegi.
LDP Secretary General. And remember that he's been the former foreign minister
Yeah.
for close to 2019 to 21 or something like that. So he's had already a lot of extensive diplomatic experience
Yeah.
with New Delhi, with
Mm.
India, right? So his focus is again likely to be continuing the Kishida Ishiba sort of politics in terms of institutionalization of free and open Indo-Pacific, making sure there's a 2+2 dialogue that continues with India, which is together with the defense and foreign ministers, right? Making sure that Japanese ODA flows into the countries in a certain way, prioritizing what is Japanese security interest in those areas. So I do not, in a nutshell, I do not see a lot of a complete shift in any way in Japan's policy towards the Indo-Pacific or towards India. What might happen is the focus or the focal points, eh, those might, change in terms of how much weightage any leader gives to what aspect of India-Japan relations.
Yeah, thank you so much for also the aspect of understanding all of the candidates. And for me, as I see right now, there's also a lot of debates on who will win actually, because there's also NHK surveys which are currently saying that actually not Takaichi-san will win, but actually Shinjiro Koizumi will win. So what do you think? Because there's right now like two people who are winning the debates that maybe they will be next premier minister, and how it will actually influence the world. As we see with the Shinjiro Koizumi, you say it's mostly about the soft power. What about Sanae Takaichi? Will she, if she will win, what will be looking the world will look like from the posture of Japan? How, what kind of relationship she will build in the future if she will be prime minister? With what countries, in your opinion?
Sure. So, see, in Japanese politics, anyway, if you look at the traditional numbers of the people who vote, it's very low. Not a lot of Japanese adults actually vote in the elections. It is consistently remained either close to 50% or lesser than that. So that's not a very high voting percentage. But in terms of who is popular at the moment, I mean, again, nothing is can be decided only on the basis of polls, because remember there are several polls. But from what I see, the trends that I'm seeing, that the Japanese public's choice is not the same as LDP's choice. So,
Mhm.
amongst the conservative population in Japan, Sanae Takaichi might be a potential candidate. But within the LDP, there are rising voices saying that we need to promote a fresh face, a young leader, a reformist image of Japan and Japanese politics. And in that case, Koizumi is more likely to win. So we never know which way it could go, right?
Mhm.
So
Yes.
LDP's choice is not necessarily the Japanese
Mhm.
choice. So
Mhm.
that only the elections will reveal. But this is very likely to, in a way, not change Japan's role in the Indo-Pacific or Japanese idea towards Indo-Pacific security, but it might lead to some sort of a course correction. No, not a major shift in any form, right? So again,
Mhm.
you might see a re-emphasis. So look at, for example, how Japan has previously tried to promote global consensus building. It has been The Japanese policy has been to bring together partners, whether South Asian or ASEAN partners, right? Japan, in a way, led when United States walked out of the TPP, Trans-Pacific Partnership. Japan took it upon itself to become the leader and promote a CPTPP, right? So Japan has earlier taken up that role in terms of economic security or consensus, global consensus building. And I don't think, no matter who comes to power, I don't think they're going to dismantle that. I don't think they're going to completely do away with that. So no matter whether Sanae Takaichi comes to power or Koizumi or another candidate comes to power, they're not going to completely overhaul or change Japanese foreign policy. But
Mhm.
their view towards, let's say, military cooperation, how much budget should be spent on militarization of Japan, right? Policy, how much of it towards climate resilience, those might be decisions. Or what kind of policies would this person come up with in terms of reforming Japanese economy or boosting the Japanese economy, that might change. Similarly, domestically, again, there are certain concerns. I earlier told you that Japan has not been able to overcome
Mhm.
that economic sluggishness domestically, or there has been very little. I mean, there have been some advances, for instance, but I also am very interested in gender issues. So I do see Japan has been trying to promote this idea of gender equality in workplace, gender, more women representation in the parliament.
Mhm.
Has there been a change? Yes. Has there been an increase in number? Yes. Is that what Japan aimed for? No, way less. So depending on how, I mean, so a candidate, for example, like Sanai Takashi would become, if she were to win, the first female prime minister of Japan.
Mhm.
Would that be sufficient for Japanese gender equality? We need to think about it, right?
Mhm.
Maybe, not necessarily. So again, depending on who comes to power, their domestic policies, their international focus, you might see some readjustments here and there. But if that leader comes and takes it upon themselves to actually implement a lot of those policies that maybe Abe aimed at or the other leaders aimed at, I think this will give them a fresh boost. This election could actually give them a fresh boost as long as they can get out of the loop. They can get out of that trap of revolving door prime ministers that Japan has had. They
Mhm.
change every 1.5 years. So
Mhm.
this person needs to get out of that,
Mhm.
kind of prove a very resilient leadership. And in the
Mhm.
past, the only resilient leader that we have seen in the past 1 decade has been Shinzo Abe, who stayed in his position. So Japan is waiting for that visionary leader, no matter who that is.
Thank you. And do you see if there will be, for example, not just two possibilities, two relation possibilities, but trilateral possibilities emerging under the new leadership? For example, there could be not just India and Japan, but there could be if somebody who, for example, went from Takaichi or Koizumi or Hayashi, what do you think? How they can maybe create and what kind of relation they can create in the future as the trilateral, like India, Japan, US, India, Japan, Australia, or involving Ukraine, for example, under this new leadership.
Sure. So, I mean, India and Japan, I mean, again, this is not a new concept. They've had previous experience being in trilateral partnerships, right? So, India, Japan, US is one. There is this emerging idea of India, Japan, and Australia promoting regional security. Similarly, there is a possibility that, let's say, as part of the climate security initiatives, you could see if the leader happens to be somebody who's environmentally conscious, they could pretty much revive and repitch the idea of climate resilience. So again, India, Japan, and some European partner like France could work together on it because India and France are already working on it, right? So trilateral partnerships or quadrilateral partnerships are very much on the table. The question remains with who, right? So one example you gave was that of Ukraine. Um,
Yes.
Sounds like a brilliant idea, but we need to see how India and Japan have currently had their advances or had their diplomatic relationship with Ukraine, right? So again, no matter who comes to power, the foreign policy of Japan is less likely to completely change. Japan's contribution to Ukraine's um, post-conflict reconstruction is way more, I would argue. Similarly, India is also looking at post-war Ukraine, that once the peace is achieved, then helping or assisting in some way in the post-conflict reconstruction. And I think that would be a very good window for the three countries to come together and form this triangular partnership
Mhm.
when Indian diplomatic or Indian resources can go and help with that initiative. Japanese money and again, Japanese sort of technological advancement can help aid in that way. And Ukraine would also benefit through its economic reconstruction or just the fact that maybe Ukraine would require a lot of reconstruction, right? So Japan and India and Ukraine can probably work on that together. So the kind of sort of emerging possibilities that I see is, for instance, I think in 2024 it was that Japanese and Ukrainian leaders they signed some 20 plus agreements or documents for cooperation. They called
Yes,
it
yes,
something
yes,
like
yes.
yeah, correct, promoting economic growth and reconstruction. So again, there is the framework already. There have been projects which have been proposed in agriculture, food industry, infrastructure, bridges, IT, information technology, cyber security. So those are
Mhm.
the areas in which Indian and Japan are already cooperating. And Japan has already, in a way, pledged or signed an agreement of cooperation with Ukraine. What remains is probably the three countries' leaders sitting together and finding how they could bridge that India Japan cooperation and create that bridge towards Ukraine so that
Mhm.
it becomes a trilateral partnership. I think also Individually, if you look at it, India and Japan have been promoting, or in some way, they have been pledging towards energy security recovery in Ukraine,
Mhm.
right? Gas turbines,
Um,
generators,
yeah.
critical energy infrastructure. That is another area of collaboration in this triangular partnership. Then, in some way, promoting the training of staff, specifically technical training. Japan has its own programs under JDS and JICA that do that already, right? With so
Mhm.
many countries in the world. India does that through its ITEC mechanism. ITEC is the framework wherein they promote technological education already, right? So again, these two could partner together and do that together with Ukrainian workforce.
Mhm.
Similarly, post-war reconstruction also means, how do you get rid of the debris? How do you get rid of previous infrastructure that is not useful anymore? So waste management, or making sure, again, Japan launched a project called the Himawari, which was the sunflower network, which was in a way representative of Ukraine as the sunflower initiative,
Yes,
right?
yes,
And the
yes.
idea was to promote Ukrainian women in the workforce, because the idea was that since the war happened, since the conflict happened, Ukrainian women have been disproportionately out of jobs. So a lot of these working women are not finding jobs as
Yeah.
a result of this economic distress. So Japan pledged in some measure to make sure that women are employed. So the moment Japanese companies make investment in Ukraine, they will try and provide jobs for these skilled women, or provide them skills so that they are employable. And I think India could pitch in with its ITech cooperation in that sphere as well. So that allows them to also, in a way, promote gender equality,
Yes.
right? I mean, Ukraine has a lot of skilled population, or probably it has a lot of population that can be upskilled in some way. So promote. I mean, again, the way that these three can cooperate are immense. There are immense possibilities. There's one more. I was hearing the Indian government announced that they were trying to, in some way, provide financial support for Ukrainian teachers to support the psychological health of Ukrainian children.
Mhm.
And if you look at the
Interesting.
Japanese Himawari, they were trying to, in a way, talk the same thing in terms of bridging and making sure that the Ukrainian kids have a community, building some sort of a community inside Ukraine and for Ukrainians in Japan. So see, there is an overlap there, trying to address the basic needs on the ground, whether it's psychological trauma or helping children or giving them education or giving them a brighter future. And I see a lot of potential in that triangular relationship.
Yes, that's a lot of also the possibility of interaction of creating relationships of trilateral, like triangular cooperation. And I hope in the future we can see it more, and we will also look and understand, monitor the how the new leadership will emerge in Japan, and what kind of hurdles it will come after. Thank you so much, Dr. Chaha, about this and for illustrating these dense questions. Now we want to open the floor for the audience questions. If you have, please keep them brief, like 2 or 3 minutes, so we can hear many voices. Thank you. If you have any questions, please ask Dr. Chaha. She will reply either in chat or just by your voice. Yeah, we have some people here. But if there is no, actually, I want also to ask you some question, if it is
Mhm.
okay. So how do you think like there's could be climate cooperation between Japan and India, and will it become a new key vector of the relation? And how? Because you say it about the green relation and the green space and space also aspect, but I wanted also to understand how this climate cooperation can emerge, and with this new technologies, how it could be becoming the new key vector of the relations. And is there any projects for the future?
Okay. Very good question, because that climate resilience project, or that climate resilience or climate change related cooperation involves a lot of subcategories, right? One is focused towards addressing the disasters that already happen as a result of climate change. So, if you're talking only in terms of India-Japan partnership, like I was earlier mentioning, India is also a very climate or disaster related, disaster prone region. So the kind of disasters we have changes based on the geography. So in the north, it's more likely to be landslides, floods, because the infrastructure is quite, let's say, inadequate to handle those. Or for instance, Japan might, on one hand, have a lot of earthquake resistance buildings, right? India is not very prone to earthquakes, but if an earthquake were to happen at the intensity that it happens in Japan from time to time, we would experience a lot of damage. And that has been
Mm.
pretty much what has been happening
Yes,
in,
yes.
in South Asia in general, right? So our buildings are not earthquake resistant at all. So the one form of climate related cooperation will happen in terms of obviously technology.
Mm-hmm.
Japan is equipped with that technology. Japan has those measures in place, whether it is in terms of how to build infrastructure, roads, buildings, railways, or just the fact that how do you create a refuge area, the Hinanjo in Japan, right? To
Mm-hmm.
make sure that people have, so they have even climate warning systems. They are very well developed in Japan. Japan has dealt with tsunami, right? Remember the New
Yes,
Year
yes, yes.
tsunami happened. So again,
A lot of
Japan has had that
things.
experience, a lot of destruction, but
Mm-hmm.
India doesn't have it. So technology is definitely one of those pillars or vectors, as you would say, where maybe it could be through training of Indian disaster risk resilient members or groups, or it could also be going on the ground and dealing with the NGOs or CSOs that directly deal at the grassroots with people who are impacted, be
Mm-hmm.
it any sort of disaster, right? That's one.
Mm-hmm.
The second form of thing would come financially. India might get a lot of technology, but can we afford in that sense? Or South Asia, can all these South Asian countries or global South countries, can they afford a lot of these disaster resilient infrastructures? Probably not. And that's wherein again Japan is very, very important to come in and pitch through those multilateral frameworks that Japan has to make sure that there is both the money and the idea behind
Mm-hmm.
it.
Yes.
Another form is the newer emerging spaces, one of which is electronic vehicles. So Japan for the longest time has been trying to promote clean energy, EVs on its streets, but does the global south have spaces for electrical vehicles, electric cars? Maybe, even if we import them, let's say from China or from Japan, do we have enough electric power stations? That goes to number three. Do we have enough electricity generation capacity? India probably today does have. But what about the other countries around India?
Mm-hmm.
Right? So those are very basic ideas when one says that we need to move towards a better climate resilient sort of energy infrastructure or climate
Mm-hmm.
resilient or a green environmental initiative. All of them need technology, they need money, they need infrastructure, and they also need a lot of know-how, technical know-how, training of people, how to
Mm-hmm.
make sure that they can use them in the long run, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, one more vector I would say is helping these countries in a way transition from CO2 generating, emissions generating nations to becoming carbon neutral at some level. And that could mean a lot of compromise. And if you look at the international forums, usually it's developing countries, including India and China, that argue that the Western nations have had their amount of economic growth that they needed, and now they're talking about climate change, but we are not that developed and we cannot afford it.
Yes.
Again, same kind of argument. So some amount of money alone is probably not enough. Those little things need to be promoted in every little aspect. For instance, if they're doing trade, can they make their trade greener? Can they promote better practices in their factories? If Japan is making an investment in India or in Southeast Asia somewhere, can it make sure that those Japanese companies at least have green practices? Can
Yeah.
they promote green building? So it will come, it can come. If it has to happen in a major way, it has to happen through looking at both the macro and the micro picture.
Yeah. To create this kind of long-term plan with all of the aspects, including. Yes, thank you. And the last question I want to ask you, what role you think women and gender equality play in modern Japanese and Indian security policy? Especially, I want to maybe you, if you can explain about your works, how you include this gender equality play in your works for now, so people will also be able to understand and also to look more into your projects that you're currently working in or worked before?
Sure. So, see, when I talk about gender in international relations, what I am referring to, at least in my study or in my research, is on this one idea of, or this one, let's say, policy, largely global policy
Mm,
of women, peace, and security. So let's understand what that means. It is a reference to a number of UNSC, United Nations Security Council resolutions that were passed, from 2000 onwards, year 2000 onwards. The first one in 2000 being the UNSC resolution number 1325, which is called the UNSC 1325, which basically was titled as Women, Peace and Security. And the idea was that to ensure that women are not just recipients of security measures, to make sure that the international politics or domestic politics is not only a male dominated zone. So women have to be part of both policy making, peace building, peacekeeping, making sure that they are part of every decision making that happens. So they are active members, they are active participants and not just recipients of security. Why is that important? Because any security related decision that is made, see, whether it is making sure that money is spent on military, or whether it is things like going to war or not going to war, it disproportionately sometimes impacts women.
mm,
Even disasters sometimes disproportionately impact women, right? They are seen in traditional roles of family, caring for children, giving up careers, or maybe they do work in political and economic spheres, but then they're not treated at par. Their
mm,
services or their contributions are not rewarded equally as maybe male contributions. So the idea is that one, you treat women at par with men based on their skills, and also you make sure that women are not just present. They are not mere faces in the office. They are not mere faces in the parliament. They are active policymakers. They have an opinion. They are part of peacemaking and peace building because it's assumed, or this is what we think, that moving away from a male dominated international relations arena would essentially mean that women bring in fresh perspectives. They know how a child suffers in a war zone. They have seen it closely, right? It is assumed that men are the ones providing security for family. So changing that idea because a woman can probably provide the same kind of security given the right opportunities,
mhm,
right? So they need to be active participants. They
mm,
can do that in many ways. They can do that even if they are in the home, providing for the family. That is also a contribution. They can do it outside of the house. They could be in the economic sphere. They could be in politics, in grassroots level engagement with people through CSOs. So women, peace, and security is that framework, essentially.
mhm,
Now, what I talk about in my research is basically a lot of countries signed up or agreed to women, peace, and security as a policy or as a principle that they would apply both in their foreign policy and in their domestic politics. A lot of countries signed up for it. More than 150 countries did. But less than 50 countries ever created a plan for it.
mhm,
That shows starkly that maybe our international relations or our domestic politics is still not free of that bias. So several nations, for instance, would had to. I mean, the idea was that once you say that you are committed to women, peace, and security, you would create a national action plan. You would create a budget. You would allocate money as a country leader, right, or as a nation, and then you would see that they are implemented. So you have a monitoring and evaluation framework. But when countries don't even have a plan, they have policies, and then policies, when there's no way to measure their success, they remain empty words. So my research focus then looks at how certain nations, which obviously, I mean, for at least since 2000, we are now in 2025, so for past 25 years, a large chunk of those countries that have created a national action plan, and these plans remain for 4 to 5 years maximum. So then they have to renew the plan and then
Mhm.
renew the plan. So there are some nations that have renewed it and they have the fifth or the sixth national action plan already. So they are more
Mhm.
proactive. And a large number of those tend to be concentrated in Europe or tend to be concentrated in the, if you look like geographically, the Western world. But there is a
Mhm.
lot of seems to be, if you look at it, seems to be that Asian countries, African countries, or the rest of the non-Western countries seem to be in a way not resist, but in some way maybe resistant. They still have the inertia. They're not open to this idea of women, peace, and security. They are open to gender equality, but maybe not women, peace, and security, right? So my research looks at how women, peace, and security is seen or is in a way formulated into a policy in Japan,
Mhm.
and if Japan has been able to promote it as a foreign policy. And so what I did in my research is I traced, because of course till 2025, 2015, Japan didn't have a national action plan. So I look at the reasons, then I look at how US developed its women, peace, and security policy, and then I try and see if there is a connection between that. And if you look
Mhm.
at basically coming to Japanese politics, if you look at how Japan has promoted it, you'll see a huge jump. There was existence of the gender equality office in the Japanese politics, of course. But a lot of these initiatives got a boost under Japanese ex-foreign minister Yoko Kamikawa, who was the foreign minister under Prime Minister Kishida. And she herself had been very committed to WPS. So she created in 2022 the Japanese Women's Parliamentary Network. She created gender equality. She appointed gender equality related personnel in the foreign ministry and made sure that they also exist in the defense ministry in Japan. So she tried to integrate the ideas of WPS into Japanese different pillars of Japanese politics, making sure that different ministries have that gender focal point. To the extent that even the Japanese self-defense forces had a gender focus, gender sort of sensitization policy, and they were able to address it through a gender focused person there who was present
Mhm.
to oversee that incorporation. And then one of the more pronounced ideas of WPS, I would argue, was when Japan launched its Himawari policy towards Ukraine.
Yes,
Because by
that's the
then,
important one.
right? So by then, Yoko Kamikawa was actually working on Japan's reconstruction efforts or Japan's efforts towards Ukraine, and they were trying to promote this idea that we're going to help a lot of women out of it. Now, because there is lack of data, it's difficult to say how successful Japan has been really in doing any of those initiatives. I mean, that was not the only one. There were other examples, such as Japan helping Sri Lanka create its own first national action plan on women, peace, and security. But again, to monitor them, to evaluate them, one needs a certain amount of, create like a proper monitoring and evaluation framework or proper budget allocation, which even Japan has in some measure, I would argue, failed to promote. Which is why you see, as a result, are there more women in Japanese politics compared to before? Yes. Have they met with their target of 35% of women in politics? No, far from that. So have they achieved women, peace, and security? No. I mean, it shows that the right leader at the right time might be able to promote and pitch that idea and maybe
Mhm.
create it as a key aspect of her foreign policy or domestic policy. But you need leaders to keep the momentum alive. So a successful foreign policy would have been that no matter who comes into power as the foreign minister or the prime minister, they should have in some way probably prioritized women, peace, and security if it were that important. But then we see since Yoko Kamikawa left that position, uh, it has been more or less stagnant. There has been no new development towards like very, very outwardly or very obvious development towards women, peace, and security, I would argue. So maybe if I were to evaluate Japanese WPS or gender security initiatives, I would say they are more aware. At least they are more, they know now what needs to be done. I think what is not yet addressed is how exactly they make sure that they achieve their targets.
Yes, that's the most important thing. And thank you so much for focusing on the gender equality and also in your works. And I hope also audience will be glad and see also by their eyes your work. Thank you so much. And as we draw to close, I want to thank Dr. Chadha for sharing her insight into how the strategy, the memory, and political change intersect in India-Japan relations. I also want to thank all of you for listening to this interview. And also, I hope this discussion reminds us that beyond trade and security, diplomacy is also about values, history, identities. And we hope this conversation sparked further reflection and collaboration. And Dr. Chada, if you have any other maybe words or opinion about what to say to youth of Ukraine, you can say right now.
Yeah, thank you so much, Maria. I mean, firstly, I need to thank you for having me over, and to
Thank
everyone
you.
else who's logging in. I suppose it must be evening in Ukraine
Yeah,
right
it's
now.
mostly evening, but it's also Saturday, so people are mostly going somewhere. Yes.
Well, I hope I didn't disturb people's nice Saturday evening
No,
evening
no, no,
plan.
no. It's just yeah, it just highlighted it. So I really also am
Well,
grateful.
thank you so much. You've been very gracious host today. I
Yeah.
also enjoyed talking to you, allowed me in a way to reflect and rethink, what I have learned so far in my study.
Mhm.
So as I mean, what I can tell people who are maybe either students of IR or maybe people who just want to stay aware of IR in general or of what's happening in the world. Because remember, we are living in times which are both one uncertain, two
Mhm.
changing very fast.
Yes,
Every day there is
dynamic.
something happening. Yes. And then it is also very conflictual. So lack of global leadership also brings in a lot of uncertainty and a lack of predictability. And that in a way is not just limited to international politics, it permeates and impacts each one of us, right? It impacts our economic security, our personal security, our future plans, no matter what stage of career we are all in. So I would strongly urge that it's good to look at the trends uh, as to regarding especially what's happening in the world. If you're an IR student, if you're not an IR student, might be good to keep up with the newer emerging technologies in some way or another. So I mean, one aspect is AI,
Yeah.
one other aspect is data science. So, I mean, there are these new emerging fields of study, and I would strongly urge that people take them up in a very interdisciplinary way. So it's not just about STEM education being like at the topmost. No, I mean, we do need people. We do need still need good humanities people. We still need good social scientists to work on these. Probably the focus will need to change. We can no longer remain in the very traditional setup wherein we look like I and Maria were talking earlier. We can no longer look at a unidimensional aspect of security. It has to be looked at together in a very multidimensional way. And to young, young people and young population in Ukraine, I would say that you have so far proven to be very resilient as a community. We don't have a very big community here in Japan of Ukrainians, but the ones that I have met have been really nice and still keeping together. They are very, I would say, they are very strong in terms of making sure that they're able to pursue their education. So I strongly urge that no matter what's happening, I mean, you've come thus far. We are all praying for peace, stability in Ukraine. And my hope is that you can, in some measure, at least continue your education or continue to pursue your career goals. And I mean, Maria has my contact. If you, I mean, maybe some of you are shy, but if you do have more questions or if you do want to reach out to her or to me, please feel free to do so. And if it's anything related to academics specifically, because I operate in the academia, if there's something that you find a common point of interest with the kind of research I do, I would be very happy to chat with you over that.
Yes, I'm also will be happy to share the contact of Dr. Chada if you're able to also ask your questions, maybe afterwards or further one. And I will also share recommended some resources of Dr. Chada. I think you will also be able to share, or you can also find it on Ritsumeikan University, Kyoto University of Japan site. So there is also a list. So we will also circulate this recording, two recordings, summary and feedback links soon. Thank you once again, and good night and good evening to everyone. I'm really thankful for your time today. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. I look forward to seeing you again, Maria,
Thank you,
and
Miss.
everybody in the room. Good luck.
Thank you.
Take
Have a nice
care.
day. Goodbye. Thank you. Goodbye,
Good
everyone.
night.
Thank you.